First, we'll start on my right. We have C.A. Higgins, who I am told allows her friends to call her Caitlin. I think we all qualify.
Go for it.
As a recent graduate from Cornell University, where she received a degree in physics, in astrophysics, was it?
Physics.
In just physics? Still, it does make it statistically likely she's the smartest person in this room. Writing-wise, she was a runner-up in the 2013 Dell Magazine's Award for Undergraduate Excellence in Science Fiction and Fantasy Writing, and is here today as a debut novelist. Next, we have Jay Allan. Jay is a former investor who moved on to the clearly more rewarding world of science fiction writing. He's the author of the ongoing Crimson Worlds military science fiction series, self-published on your favorite ebook platform, which would be Nook. Thank you very much. Dude, I'm setting you up, and then no, never mind. But when not writing, he enjoys traveling, hiking, reading. But what he really wants you to know is that he is an excellent correspondent and always answers his emails. To my left, we have Michael Swanwick. In his long science fiction career, Michael has won 5 Hugo Awards and 1 Nebula. Among his works are the novels such as Dancing with Bears, the short story collection, The Dog Said Bow Wow, as well as various critical essays on science fiction and a biography of the pioneering author and poet and sadly overlooked personality Hope Mireless. And he comes to us from Philadelphia, so thank you. Catherynne Valente won the James Tiptree Jr. Award for her first major novel, The Orphan's Tales. Or next? No, that's okay. It's a safe space. We can share our emotions. Her next, Palimpsest, was nominated for the Hugo Award, and her YA phenomenon, The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making, became a New York Times bestseller and a little bit of a tongue twister. She came to us from a small island off the coast of Maine where she lives with her partner, 2 dogs, and a cat. Thank you. And at the end, Judd Winick, who is an award-winning cartoonist who scripted various fan-favorite characters such as Batman, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, other Justice Leaguers, Star Wars characters, etc. He is the head writer for the Hulu animated series The Awesomes, they're plural. But, of course, reality TV fans will remember him as a cast member of MTV's The Real World San Francisco, where he roomed with AIDS activist Pedro Zamora when it chronicled their friendship in the graphic novel Pedro and Me, which may be required reading for anyone who, say, attends a comic book convention. Judd Winick. So we're here to talk about science fiction and specifically the ways in which imagination and awe and the ways that these worlds of imagination fire our imaginations as readers. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start by asking our panel to describe how some of these themes of wonder and awe and world creation have manifested in the books that have brought you here today. And since I started this way, I'll start this way. Judd, perhaps you could start with?
Oh, the pressure's on. Well, I think when we talk about science fiction, fantasy, when telling these big stories of fiction, I tend to write exactly what I want to see. In a lot of cases, it's trying to remember what it's like to be a kid. I mean, I think most of us probably have a very clear memory when they've read that book for the first time, which completely blew their heads off. Or, I was 7 when Star Wars came out, and I can still probably remember what the movie theater smelled like. As the credits rolled, and I had that oh my God moment. So if there's any way to sort of like try to capture like that oh my God moment, you try as hard as you can, bend from the knees and get it out there. I'd say that. try to get that one moment where you're grabbing a reader or a viewer, which try to blow their heads off.
Noble cause, Catherynne.
Well, Radiance is my first big girl science fiction novel. I've written fantasy up till now. And one of the unusual things about it is it takes place in our solar system, but a version of it in which all the planets are inhabited and inhabitable. And that came from my love for old school science fiction, where people weren't quite sure that you couldn't live on some of these planets. And so their imaginations weren't constrained by the images that we get from the probes that we've sent out. And we're able to just create Zelazny's incredible water world Venus and Bradbury's Mars and all those incredible worlds that absolutely lit my mind on fire when I was a child. And I can't help it. I was a tiny bit disappointed to grow up and find out I was definitely never going to get to be a cowboy on Mars. That was just not going to happen for me. So I can write books where there's cowboys on Mars, though, and make it a little bit better. And I really enjoy, when I'm writing science fiction, going back to that unconstrained mindset where anything is possible. And who is to say that in a couple of centuries we won't have terraforming enough to make some of those things a reality? It's not as unrealistic as all that. So that's really one of the big things in science fiction that makes me excited, combining that golden and silver age imagination with just enough realism and pragmatism to keep your feet on the ground and your head in the sky.
I'm probably pretty best known for rather intellectual works, and so the Darger and Surplus stories are an exception. I wrote a story. I wanted to write a story about a talking dog, so I created a human-sized talking dog. He stood on two legs. He had full human intelligence, but he was obviously a dog. You could see by looking at him, and I put him on the docks of a future London, a post-utopian London, so he could have someplace to stand. And because he needed somebody to talk to, I had a con man named Aubrey Darger come up and start a conversation. And they just ran off with the plot at that point. And at the end of the first story, they accidentally set fire to London. And as they're leaving on boat, they look back, and Darger said, and Surplus said, "I can't help but feeling in part responsible," which is a line that I stole from Bart Simpson. And Darger said, "London has burned down before, and it will burn down again. Lift up your hearts. You decide you're going off to Moscow to run a scam." And so they go off to Moscow, and where they set fire to Moscow. And about that point, I realized that they were on a trip around the world. So for my second full-length book of their adventures, I sent them to China. I will not reveal what happens when they finally reach Beijing, but in the course of the novel, they do conquer the entire country of China by accident. These things happen. And this is, I think, the first time I've had a series that was just about having fun. But I think that's an important function of science fiction.
None of this is working through some of your own pyromaniac tendencies? Asking for a friend, just making sure.
Not at all.
Jay?
Yeah, I'd say for me, what always attracted me in science fiction was definitely the world-building aspect. I think people sometimes don't realize, if you read a historical fiction novel, a lot of the history that those characters that led to their world that they live in. When you start to do something that's science fiction, you sit down to write it, I think you have to remember it's something completely new, your readers don't know, and it can be easy, I think, sometimes to make those characters live in a sort of a vacuum which feels a little two-dimensional, and you want to really build the world. I mean, a lot of times you'll have a story in mind. Stories tend to be similar. You see various people say there are only X number of actual plot lines and things. But to me, it's the world building and the depth of it that really makes science fiction and fantasy too, worth reading. It's interesting and it's exciting. And when, especially with series being as popular as they are, most of my books are written in series, is to be telling the story, but really building this world around your characters so people understand, why they're there, if they're fighting, what are they fighting for, what made them become what they are, and the history of that world a little bit, but without turning a book into an encyclopedia, which that always attracted. I was always very attracted to books that did that, and if I'm not reading a fiction book, I'm probably reading a history book. So that was always interesting to me. So creating the alternate histories is the most interesting part of writing science fiction to me, for sure. So.
Caitlin?
There's a planet around another star where it rains diamonds. It doesn't feature in my book, but there's so many strange and beautiful things that exist in real life, in the universe, that I'm really interested in what it'd be like to visit those places, and also how those things would affect the people who actually see them. So.
It's fantastic. Thank you. We touched on this a bit, Jay. You said the magic void, which is about world building, which is always something that we talk about in science fiction and in all sorts of fiction writing. But science fiction has a special place, it seems to me, when it comes to world building. Some wags have said that the difference between epic fantasy and science fiction is that the fantasists can create a world that just out of a whim, but science fiction writers have to have the burden and privilege of creating a world that is tied to, in some ways, reality, at least so that is familiar to readers. I was wondering what y'all's approach was to your world building from that point of view.
When I've done superhero comics, a lot have been established for me. And when you do superhero comics, a lot of the stuff, the trick of it is writing superheroes, characters, and worlds which you're only kind of allowed to write from A to B. Like, Batman's not going to evolve too much, so you've got to figure out between A and B how to tell that story. When doing that, it is about sort of like expanding upon like the world, the environments that have already been created. This time through, I was lucky enough. So my new book is HILO. It's a graphic novel, all ages. Sweet spot is kids 8 to 12. It takes place on Earth, but very early on, I was being asked, so where exactly does this take place? And the only answer I had is like, it sort of takes place in sort of like, Steven Spielberg land 1980. It's like a lot of open spaces, not because I don't like drawing backgrounds, which sometimes I don't, but it was one of these things where I was trying to create an environment that was like, was going to capture that feeling when I was a kid and seeing those movies, and felt like suburbia with, when the kids ran off, it seemed like nothing else was around. Like they'd run to the backyard, go through the woods, they'd be out, and suddenly fields and sky. And I thought that was really, really cool, and I actually kind of wanted to capture that feeling for the book. And also, it gives you lots of room for giant robots. And if you're in a field in the middle of nowhere, no one can see it, and you don't have to explain that. Then there's no cops or army or things like that, which also was like, it's a bit of a trope that sometimes you have things which are so far away from everything else, it allows you to do all kinds of mischief and not get caught. I would do that in comics, like how do we get our story away from everybody else? So, so just that, like, police, cops, authority figures, the government aren't going to take notice of this. And when doing a story about kids, you also want them to be away from school, their parents, the whole thing. So sometimes world building actually takes place right here on Earth. You're trying to occupy, again, like a small stretch of land. So that's what I was doing this time around.
One of the first things I try to think about in terms of world building is the question, what does everybody know? There are things in every culture that people know without discussing it, without having to think about it really. Even something as basic as gravity, we know that at no point today is anybody going to fly up into the air, circle around the Javits Center a couple of times, and come down. Like we don't have to talk about that. That's not a Santa Claus conversation we need to have. And so when you're talking about a world that's not our own, you also have to ask, in that world, what does everybody know? What is the cultural assumptions that are not addressed? And the thing is that most stories involve somebody either finding out that what everybody knows is wrong or finding out that what everybody knows is right. So determining what those base assumptions of the world are it's a really great sort of stepping stone to everything else. The way you get that information across is, of course, the eternal challenge of science fiction and fantasy: how to build a world without boring the reader to tears with info dumps, and just bringing everything to a screeching halt to talk about why trees are a different color, and who bred the president's horses. One of the ways, I've done it a number of ways with different books. One of the ways that I did it in Radiance was to include a lot of ephemera from the world. It's an alternate history. So there's bits of scripts from the radio program that everybody listens to and is obsessed with through the solar system, gossip columns, interrogation transcripts as well, movie scripts, all of the stories that the culture tells about itself. I just sort of let that culture tell the story of its own history through its media, because that is how we tell ourselves our history. That's how we tell each other what we know. What everybody knows in our culture. We watch movies, we watch television, we listen to music and the radio, and all of those things give us our culture, give us our assumptions, and give us our expectations of how life is going to go. And so I wanted to use that same referential pop culture thing that we all love to do. I mean, it's part of why we're all at Comic-Con, but with a completely fictional universe and media properties that have never existed. So that was a lot of fun for me, and one of the ways that I tried to build the world of Radiance.
World building involves a lot of research, and not just from books, but from going out and looking at things. The first time that I set a story in a space habitat, I took my notebook out to the mall, because I figured this was the same kind of enclosed, very controlled situation where they're trying to convince you that you're in a human habitat, but you're not. And
Pinkberry.
so for
knocking the yogurt.
For this novel, I put together the best plan that I ever had, which was I got tickets for my wife and I take a tour of China, and we were in a group that included my sister and my brother-in-law, who is Chinese and speaks Chinese, and a couple of other my favorite people in the world, and so I was going to have this great time, and my part of it would have been tax deductible because it was all research. And then the day before the plane took off, I came down with a mild fever. Now, if you go into Beijing International Airport, they walk through thermometer gates. And if you're running a fever, they put you into quarantine. So I didn't get to go. But my wife took a notebook with her, and she made a lot of the kind of notes that she knew that I would make. And there are a lot of things that you cannot find out from books because they're so obvious to the people there. In Guilin, the city of Guilin smells of osmanthus trees. They're everywhere. Huh. You can probably know that Beijing is gray, but you don't know that Xi'an, which is that wonderful walled city up to the north and west, is tan. And these are the kind of details that you really want. So when I wrote the book, I was relying very heavily on my wife's notes and trying at the same time to make China stranger and more interesting even than it is, which is not easy because it's a wonderful, wonderful country. And I found that all the places that she'd been, I could build on her notes, and the places where she hadn't been were much more difficult to write about because the information in books didn't give you that sense you have of being there.
But I have to ask, so did you also, just as an aside, because I'm sure other people are wondering, so did you spend the entire week or two in quarantine, like with the flu, watching The Wire on your laptop? What happened?
No, I came down the day before the plane, so I stayed home. Oh. And I just, I lay in bed and I felt sorry for myself for 2 weeks. But I had another opportunity. I went again this year and spent 3 weeks with Allan and Eileen Gunn and some other friends. So I did have the wonderful experience of being in China, but it wasn't tax deductible.
I think that temperature gate is the most science fictional thing we've talked about. That's crazy.
That was my second time in China. I'd been in just to a convention in Chengdu before, and because there was a mix-up in Chicago, I arrived a day late, and I discovered that what the guy in Chicago meant when he said not to worry about the connecting flight was that when I found out that I couldn't get on it, it wouldn't be he wouldn't be anywhere near to take the blame for it. And I discovered that if you're walking around in Beijing International Airport looking for some help from the signage, that's when you get a sense of just how alien a language Chinese is.
Yeah.
Well, I have to agree with a lot of that in the sense of, well, a lot of you probably are not from New York. You came here for Comic-Con. You go home, people ask you if you had a good time, what happened, and think about what you'll tell them. You were here for a couple of days, all the things you saw and the impressions that you got, both of the convention but of the city too. And now imagine you're trying to tell a story and you have a city, and what it takes to actually build enough of that, some of the issues like smell of the trees is a good kind of an example like that, that really describes that and makes it seem real to someone versus just mentioning the characters are in a big city. And that's part of the world building too, to make it seem real even though it's science fiction and it's not real. You want to make it seem plausible. You want to be able to believe it and imagine yourself in it while you're reading the story. I think that's an important part of remembering the amount of sensation someone gets even when they go somewhere for a couple of days or they go on a vacation. They tell stories about it for the rest of their life. Oh, it was great. I did this, we did that. They had this building, the cult, and all of that. And remember that you have to do your best to create that in a science fiction story so people will understand those places and they'll seem real and they'll be important within the story. So I think that's a big part and an important part of it. And then the other thing just is in terms of, I draw a lot of themes from real history. Not a copy of history, but if you think about some of the events in actual history, anything you're going to imagine in a science fiction narrative, something similar has happened, the fall of Rome. I mean, there's all kinds of situations where you can imagine how people reacted, and you can read to a certain extent and research how people reacted and imagine how they would do it in that situation in a science fiction setting. I tend to try to keep reasonably close to legitimate science in my books. I mean, people do different things on that. I'm not going to let it destroy a story. I mean, we all have mulligans. Faster than light travel is certainly one a lot of us, use. If we want to get out of the solar system, we kind of have to make something up, whether it's hyperspace or warp gates or whatever we want to call it. And so you can't destroy the story over it. But I do like to stay fairly close to scientific reality. But that doesn't mean you can't do fun and exciting things. And you have a lot of real world themes. My Far Star series, I promised HarperCollins an unadulterated space opera, and I think, with my gifted editorial team, I think we came pretty close to delivering that. So there's pirates, but they're not that different than pirates would be on the ocean. A lot of the situations in the stories are similar. They're just in a vaster setting and a different kind of a situation, which is, I think that's important. You're trying to reimagine themes that people are familiar with in new and exciting settings, and to me, that's what I try to keep in mind when world building.
What I find interesting about world building is how it affects the characters, because they're all products of whatever culture you're setting up. And so if someone's grown up in like a surveillance state, the way they express themselves is different than they would if they hadn't been observed. And so I think it makes it feel a lot more real, the world that you're telling the reader, if the characters really feel like they've come from it and are part of the same fabric that makes up the rest of the world.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, you've spoken about how your characters are the important part of the stories that you're telling in the world that you've created. Michael, you mentioned how your characters just sort of ran away with your plot, which is a scary. It's a scary thought to think that your characters have an agency that their creator does not normal.
Oh no,
think of it.
that's a gift from God when that. I wrote a story once about a future America where everything had fallen into decay, and they basically worshipped Janis Joplin. So I had had a character who had been programmed to basically live Janis Joplin's tragic life, and I read a lot of books about Janis Joplin. So when I was writing it, I'd be writing laboriously, and someone would go, "Janis, I want to get some advice from you." And she'd say, "Well, I don't know about advice. I'm more the bad example type." I got her voice in my head, and she just everything that she said just went like that. And then the rest of it was like usual clawing your way through granite with your fingertips, which is, by the way, that's really what writing is like, I'm afraid.
If I could just come back around to world building for just a second. A few people talked about traveling and seeing the places you're writing about as much as you can in person. And I do want to defend research via books for just a second, because it's true that there's so much you can't get from books, but there are incredible narrative nonfiction books out there and non-narrative nonfiction books. When I wrote my novel Deathless, which is set during the Siege of Leningrad in World War II, I read The 900 Days, which is the standard history of the Siege of Leningrad. And I expected it to be terrible, and there's a reason it's standard. It's amazing. And he starts the book talking about, and you made me think of it, that Leningrad was covered in non-fruiting lime trees. So the lime trees were in flower, but they would never fruit. And the smell of them and the popular song on the radio that everyone was singing the autumn that the siege began. I've been to St. Petersburg. I didn't go there in the spring. I would never have known that about the lime flowers, even having visited there. And I certainly wouldn't have known that song. But what he was doing in this nonfiction book was world building. We talk a lot about how realism doesn't have to build worlds. They absolutely do. Even if that world is just a suburb, it is a contained world just like any science fictional or fantasy universe. They just have a certain set of givens that we don't necessarily have. But there's tons of world building to be done, and you can learn a lot from narrative nonfiction, because they absolutely have to bring you into the world of the historical period they're writing about exactly the same way a science fiction or fantasy author does.
Yeah, something you'd said earlier about how in Radiance you're using the various bits of cultural ephemera to inform the world. But that struck me as interesting, because when I was reading Radiance, one of the effects of all of that, all of those cultural appropriations, really spoke to character in a certain way. So not to give away spoilers, but there's so much about the book which is about missing people, and just seeing how you're constructing those relationships and those characters through these artifacts is sort of fascinating. How did you come to that as far as character building goes?
Well, I mean, like I said, I explained why I wanted to use all that ephemera. Radiance is many of the characters are filmmakers or involved in the film industry in some way, so they connect to each other. Via film, via those cultural references, just the way we do. My parents met at UCLA Film School, so it's fairly personal to me. My family mostly doesn't talk about feelings. We just quote movies that are relevant to our feelings. And it's like a code, and it works for us. But I couldn't just throw a whole bunch of, scripts and articles in there and expect anybody to care. Each one of them had to pull double duty, had to reveal something about the world, but also reveal something about a character so that it could move the plot along. And most of them, 75% of the time, it also pushes the plot forward a little bit. So each one of them had to not only be, the Radiance universe's equivalent of a Tarantino script, it also had to be connected to somebody. So somebody will reference it later on in that I'm not talking about my feelings, I'm just talking about the Madame Mortimer mystery movies that I loved when I was a kid, and I can keep myself safe and not vulnerable because it's Madame Mortimer saying it and not me. And we do that all the time. It's not just my family. We all do it. And I think it's such a real and human thing to do. And we've been doing it since, Homer was around and people were referencing the Iliad in their daily life. And I think that one of the things that I found missing in a lot of science fiction and fantasy was that idea of what does a science fictional or fantastic culture create as a culture? What is their art? What is speculative fiction in a magical universe? And so I wanted to explore all that, but I didn't want to just explore it by sitting at my typewriter boring everyone else. So I tried to knot it together with a character every step of the way. I hope I did okay at that.
I think it's true. It's one of the things that it's kind of unspoken, especially how we grew up now. When building characters and building these, a lot of the sterile stories we've read growing up, the characters didn't seem to have any kind of life or popular culture. They're mostly focused on exactly what they're doing. And most of us, we actually find each other by what we like. Like most of us here, there's, everybody in this room, if we all went back and forth, there's probably about 10 different things that we like, which, we could all agree upon, more or less, which bring us to New York Comic Con. And it's a great shorthand for characters, when you can just tap into that, like the kids in my book. It's spoken briefly, but they're comic book fans, which tells you what kind of kids they are. And one of them mentions how much she likes. She's a big reader. She likes astronomy, which I think tells you volumes. Just by knowing what they like and what they love, it tells in a way. Well, it's what I always found it like. This is like almost like a musical number. Musicals where a character will stop and sing about what's going on in their heart and their head. Sometimes that's great. Sometimes I would just really like to know that they like the Fantastic Four. And that would clear it all up for me real quick.
I'm not going to lie, there's musical numbers in Radiance. But I think it does come down to also people who are obsessed with things and people who like things are more interesting than people who just want to get to the end of the quest.
Yeah.
And obsession creates interest. We are all interested in each other because of our obsessions, and it goes far beyond Comic-Con and the communities that we create around the things we're obsessed with. As soon as you find out something somebody else is interested in, you know exponentially more about them. And you have to treat your characters the same way. Like if you were on a date with one of your characters and they just said to you exactly what you've written down in the book, would you be interested in them? Maybe, maybe not, but you got to create them as though they are selling themselves to you because they're selling themselves to your audience.
Well, I think that with the characters is touching on something also, is the motivations of the characters and what they do in the plot. You want to make it real. You want to make it believable. It's great to say a character is obsessed with vengeance. The reader wants to understand and know why and realize what happened to this character that made him like that. And you need the world and the history to work with that. You can't just say, well, he's chasing this villain and he's obsessed with getting him. If you just say that, it's not real. It doesn't have any power behind it. You don't have the reader, assuming the reader would be on his side in that and hoping that he gets his vengeance, wanting it too because they know what terrible thing happened to him. You have to work that history in, or the characters can be very, two-dimensional and not really seem real. Real people have everything everybody does, everything everybody feels about something has come from innumerable experiences in their lives. You don't know any of that about a fictional character because somebody just sat down at a computer and started typing him, and that's where he started from. He doesn't have a real past unless you create it. So I think sometimes when you put characters in situations that are going to drive the plot, you really have to build enough around that so that it feels real, it seems real, that there's something to it, and the reader understands it.
No, I ran across Kit Reed once at a convention. I said, how's it going, Kit? And she says, I'm in mourning. I just finished a novel, and there are these people I've been living with for over a year, and they're all gone. It's as if they all died. And she said, doesn't it feel that way to you? And I thought for a second. I said, no, actually the opposite. When I finished that last page, I picture all my characters running down the street, waving their hands, going, I'm free, I'm free. I'm going to go buy a hamburger and eat it, and nothing's going to happen to me. And this was the reason why, up until recently, I never wrote anything in a series, because at the end of my stories, they tended to be so fierce. It would be cruel to bring a character back into that situation again. And even George Martin loves his characters. You have an obligation to do horrible things to them, but that you really do get caught up in them. And that was the reason that Dark and Surplus were a godsend to me, because at the end of each adventure, they're ready for more of the same because they're completely delusional. They believe that they are good people who are having an excellent time, and they're not. They're horrible people who are having a horrible time, but that's their one blind spot. And I have no conclusion for this.
I'm a little more amoral. I'm perfectly willing to torture them again in another book, so they get a little bit of a break, and then it comes back to haunt them. So,
Caitlin, where do you fall on this cruelty towards your characters versus giving them a break from time to time?
Make them bleed.
Yay!
They're born to suffer, so.
You're born to suffer.
I just finished the last book in my middle grade series, which I started in 2009. It's really been a huge part of my life. And I didn't feel they died, but I did feel like my kids were going off to college. Like they were moving out, and I wouldn't be able to control them anymore. Or teach them anything. But there was, I understand the mourning thing. Not that they were dead, but just they're all grown up out of my hands.
Gone. So we've talked about the worlds that we've created in your books. We've talked about some of the approaches to characters. So the third part of the triangle is, of course, these guys, the readers. So I'm curious, do you think about this, or how do you think about this? What do you want to make the reader feel from your books? What do you want them to experience after reading your books?
I just want them to feel like it's the most wonderful book in the world.
Yeah.
Because that's what I want from a book. Every time I pick up a book, I'm going, I hope that this book is so wonderful, it makes me throw it against the wall out of envy.
How many of has that happened before? How dented are your walls? Do you have a good contractor?
It happens less and less as I get older and grow better. And I'm aspiring to get better yet. The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe is a good example. That's just knocked me out. And there are books that they come along and they're just so wonderful you can't believe a human being could write them. And that's, I believe, what we're all aspiring to do.
I have a little button at home, and it says, "Go ahead, book, change me, do it." And that's what I want. The wonderful thing about being a reader is that it changes the way you see the world, and you see with a double vision everywhere you go. I'm not driving through upstate New York, you're also seeing the setting of Little Big and all of the stories that were part of that novel. I want my books to just a tiny little bit change the way people see and give them that double vision that wonderful books have given me.
I've always described it as when I get really, really into something, a story, a book, a movie, a TV show, that it makes my teeth itch. It's just, and I mean this, I mean it in the best way possible. That it's like oh my God, like that was so great, like that. Oh, that it's that feeling. And if I could remotely capture that, well, I try to do that. I'm lucky because I draw my stuff. So, I'm a cartoonist, so I get to do all kinds of cheats. I get to have actual, honest-to-God, quiet moments where nobody talks. And for me, those are some of my teeth-itching moments because you kind of feel like what's going to happen next, and you're wondering what they're thinking. I had this big. I can call it a crutch or, again, an advantage of being able to show what's going on, show a character's face, and you're wondering or what's going on in their heads. As far as how to keep a reader going, I cut my teeth both on writing a ton of superhero comics, which is a decade of it. That is purely 25 pages, and now we're gonna take a break. I'll see you in a month. The best ones are when you put down the comic. It's like, okay, I'm gonna die. I want to know what's happening next right now. And actually, that unfortunately now I've done it with 200 pages, and there's going to be 9 months in between for a series of 6 books. I say the big difference is the characters don't go from A to B. I got the whole alphabet to mess with because they're mine. But I remember as a kid reading comics and reading cartoons, which just made my teeth itch because the way something looked and the way something felt. I really try to accomplish the big ones in a few words and maybe an expression.
So you're promising that HILO is going to evolve more than Batman?
Yeah. It's not saying very much, but the bar's set really low from in this story arc, Batman is angry and vengeful. Next story arc, angry and vengeful.
Vengeful
Yes, you got it. No, totally inverse it. You're right. That's how to make it work. You're getting it. You could write comics.
Jay, do you have a thought of your readership?
Well, the first thing I try to keep in mind with every book is that people are reading it for entertainment. So I try to keep a lot of action, keep the plot moving quickly. Remember that it is entertainment. As far as themes are concerned, There are a lot of things to draw on. I like to, if you look at history, I mean, everybody, came here to Comic-Con because they felt like it. And if you think about the history of the human race and even the present, the vast majority of human beings who've lived never, ever had that kind of control over their lives. And technology is a tyrant's dream if you think about it in a lot of ways. And I think those are kinds of themes to explore. Like, I don't fall too heavily in the optimistic, wonderful, utopian future. My stuff's more, if I want to say something in a book, I'm going to try to warn about wrong turns that people can take in the future, and then the situation. A lot of times my characters are in a situation created by those wrong turns. They're trying to fight to get their freedom back or something of that nature, because I think that's a way to sort of put some thought into something that can also be just entertaining and fast-paced and interesting. And so that's kind of the way I try to look at it and try to split those things. Yes, I'd like to make people think about some things that are maybe relevant, but also I want them to enjoy the book and just come home from work and they're tired and they sit in a chair and they enjoy reading it for a couple hours, and that's a victory too, I think. So.
When I'm reading a good book, I just lose track of what's going on around me. Like I can't read on the subway, or I'll end up in Queens, somewhere I've never been. And after
Not that there's anything wrong with that. Is anyone from
not
Queens?
that there's
I'm just
anything
saying,
wrong
that
with
was-
Queens.
Okay.
And when I finished it, I still feel, after I close the book, I still feel like I'm sort of in it, like it's a cloud and it's followed me out. And you can't really talk to me when I'm like that, because I won't talk sense, because I'm still part of the world, I'm still part of the characters, even if it's not necessarily a positive feeling. Like when I read Haunting of Hill House, and I was scared of people knocking on my door for a couple hours. And so my goal my hope when a reader finishes my book is that they have part of that, like they're still stuck in there with the characters in the world, and that when they're reading it, time runs according to how it's running in the book as opposed to how it's running actually outside.
I think we're going to have some time for a few questions, but so cogitate, think of a few of them from the audience. But before that, I had one for myself because, Michael, you mentioned the Gene Wolfe, which which reminded me that as fantastic a bookseller as I am, and I am, nobody is better at recommending good books to read than authors of good books. So I was wondering if I could get some recommendations for the crowd and for myself from all y'all. And since you've already given one, you should give one again.
Okay, I will give one. Cixin Liu's The Three-Body Problem. This is the first volume of a trilogy. The second volume, The Dark Wood, just came out. It was a phenomenon in China. In China, science fiction readership peaks senior year of high school, and then it dwindles through university and goes to zero at graduation. So it's a YA literature there, although there's some wonderful work being done in it. And this was the first book that became a bestseller. First science fiction book became a bestseller in China. Came here, it's selling really well too. It's full of great ideas. And I was reading and going, the characters are a little simply drawn. The prose is not up to Gene Wolfe level, but it's full of ideas I haven't read before. And in science fiction, that means the world. Also won the Hugo Award this year.
But just recommend any book is so broad, so I'll say a bunch.
Like a good
so
narrative
Kim,
nonfiction, for example.
I really recommend The 900 Days. I think it's a masterclass on how to write historical nonfiction. It's amazing. Kim Stanley Robinson's 2312 is an absolutely extraordinary solar system story as well. I'll cheat a little and say Michael Swanwick's The Iron Dragon's Daughter, which you didn't mention in your list, even though it's the greatest. I love it so much. It's one of my all-time favorite novels. Helen Oyeyemi's Mr. Fox is incredible. It's sort of loosely a Bluebeard kind of story, but it's wildly metafictional and crazy, and it's the first book that's made me cry when it was over in years. Haroun in the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie is one of my very favorite books for young readers. There's a million. All the books are great. That's not true at all.
That's
Actually,
right,
that's
yeah.
a total lie.
Yeah.
All the books are not good. I don't even know
Many,
how that
many
came out of my mouth.
That's true.
So many bad
But,
books.
Well,
but
at
many
the-
books are good.
Charitably, we could say this. Even if you read a bad book, you are better off than somebody who is not reading.
You have to read books you hate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, that's how you learn what you like. And if you have hopes of being a writer, that's how you learn what you want to write. You have to read bad books. Like, bad books are just as important as good books in a different way.
Also, in badly written books, the tricks are you can see the tricks being done. And it's like a friend of mine who was an amateur magician, and she always went to see this one old magician in Baltimore who was slowing down and trembling, so you could see how half the tricks worked. And it was cheaper than to go see him than it was to buy the books.
Oh, and Hope Mealy's Lead in the Mist, which he mentioned earlier. Lead in the Mist is an incredible fantasy by a woman named Hope Mealy's. Won't get into it here. Obviously, Michael Swanwick, you can ask him any questions about it. It is kind of a Lord of the Rings, or like a Hobbit before the Hobbit. It's great. You should definitely find it.
Okay, I'll do three. One, because I just reread it. If you've never read Kurt Vonnegut's Galapagos, you should go do that now. It's one of, I want to say it's the lesser known works, but it's not exactly the first one people talk about, and it's so wonderfully insane. It starts a million years in the future when all that's left of the human race is on the Galapagos Island, and then it goes back a million years to tell you how they got there and what happened. And it has nothing to do with the people actually are on the island. And it's hilarious and perverse. And you read it and go, I can't believe he came up with this so long ago. Another one's a great graphic novel, which they just re-released, called Why I Hate Saturn by Kyle Baker. And yeah, if you haven't read that, you should read that. It's one of the funniest graphic novels I've ever read still. It starts in one place and goes another. It starts off, it's like about a woman who is a journalist and she works for a magazine in New York City, and then it winds up being kind of a buddy action film with her insane sister who thinks she's the queen of Saturn. And it all still feels very realistic, and it's drawn really well. And the last one, nonfiction-wise, which is, I read this right before I began this book series, HILO. Street Gang, which is the history of Sesame Street. And it's a big book, which oddly is like a page turner. It's like you wouldn't think learning about the birth of children's television would be that interesting, but I was going to do this series about and for kids, and I kind of wanted to know, what it was like when it started, in my opinion, like some of the best children's storytellers, which were trying to tell a simple story. So I highly recommend Street Gang, among those two others. There, that's what I got.